Old News episode 20. We are so excited to have made it this far. So grateful to be at episode 20, able to keep bringing you new scientific discoveries. My name is Laura Beth, and I'm going to be your host today. So I'll be keeping an eye on our chat and making sure I don't miss any questions from you all, or comments as well. You can make both throughout the program. So we might have some old news newbies here in the YouTube with us. So I just wanted to remind some of you that you can play old news bingo throughout this program. And we've got a link to play bingo right there at the top of the chat. And if you would like to, you can turn on closed captions for this program by clicking that button that says CC at the bottom of the video. They are computer generated captions. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Christian Kammerer, the paleontologist who makes this program happen, and our museum's research curator of paleontology. So, hey, Christian.
Hey, Laura Beth. Good to see you again. Good to be back.
I know, it's so exciting.
Yeah, new season of Old News.
I know, a new season. What will it bring?
Also, I'm sure all sorts of amazing paleontological discoveries. We've had a good summer field season, collecting a lot of fossils, both here in North Carolina and out west here in the Paleo unit. But yeah, ready to dive back into some of the published discoveries, the things that we found. You know, it'll be a few years yet before those actually come out. But rest assured, I will tell you when they do.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so excited. And we've already been talking in the chat with some of our participants about lizards, and I'm really excited to talk about lizards today. As you know, Christian, they're one of my favorite animals, lizards and cats. So
yeah, I know you've got some pet lizards.
I do.
Yes, they do. They make
I'm surrounded by lizards all day. Not just pets, but also, you know, those wild friends that live in our backyards. I get so excited. I see a lot of anoles.
Anolis carolinensis.
Yeah, Carolina. Yeah. So let us know in the chat if you like lizards, if you see them around your house, or, you know, let us know if you have lizard questions. We already have one from Anne, but I'll save it for later, because Anne, your question might get answered when Christian goes over some of our research today.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So first, you know, talking about lizards, they're reptiles in many ways, sort of like, you know, the canonical reptile, the reptiliest thing that people think of when they think of reptiles. But it's worth considering that a little bit, like what we really mean when we say reptile. So let's actually hop, rather than usually we look at the, you know, through time, but let's look at sort of through evolutionary history and like relatedness with this diagram here, showing how different groups of modern animals with backbones, these are vertebrates, are related. So this just shows the land vertebrates, animals that are called amniotes. That's anything with an amniotic egg, which are eggs that are, you know, basically laid on land or are secondarily retained in the body for animals that give live birth. So of sort of the major groups of animals that are amniotes, you've got mammals, birds, and reptiles. And mostly when people say reptiles, they think of, you know, cold-blooded, scaly skin, things like alligators, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, and turtles. But as you can see on the diagram here, that's not a natural group. So they're split across amniote phylogeny. And sort of the scientific definition of reptilia, this group of the reptiles, necessarily includes birds, which are, of course, descendants of dinosaurs, sort of the best known fossil reptile group. So birds are, you know, reptiles in a sense, but again, you know, mostly people are thinking of the scaly things when they say reptiles, although, you know, birds, they do have scales too on their legs. So reptiles can be broken up into two major groups. The archosaurs, the so-called ruling reptiles, which include the crocodilians, and then the bird lineage of dinosaurs and modern birds. And then the lepidosaurs, or scaly reptiles, which includes the basically lizards, snakes, and their allies, that whole lineage. So the lepidosaurs, they've got two sort of major modern groups, but one of them is very species poor. These are the Rancocephalians, or the sphenodonts. Only one sort of living genus of this group. This is the Tuatara, which is restricted to the island of New Zealand in the southern Pacific Ocean. So Rancocephalians used to be a lot more diverse and abundant. In the Mesozoic, there were, lots and lots of species of Rancocephalians and a lot of anatomical diversity there. And the Tuatara is sort of like the sole survivor of that. And for that reason, has sometimes been called a living fossil, which is sort of a fraught term that, many paleontologists advise against sort of using willy-nilly. But it's just to get across the idea that it's sort of the last, it's a relictual taxon, and it's very sort of morphologically conservative compared to Mesozoic sphenodonts. It looks very similar. Even though that doesn't mean that, necessarily behaviorally, ecologically, genetically, it is sort of a static or archaic organism. It's been doing its own thing for the past 65 million years. But there are very few of them. Whereas the other group, the squamates, are sort of one of the incredible success stories of not only reptiles, but all vertebrates. So squamates are the most diverse of any of the land-living vertebrate groups, with over 11,000 known species and more being discovered all the time. So this is the group that mostly includes the lizards, and then two subgroups that are descended from lizards, the amphisbaenians, or the so-called worm lizards, which are reduced limb, sort of burrowing creatures, and of course the snakes, which are also known for their reduced limbs, completely absent in most groups. So these are both descendants of lizards, and together they make up squamates. Now, squamates may be the most diverse and abundant of modern reptiles, but when you look at deep time, their fossil record isn't as extensive as we might hope. So here we are going to hop over to sort of the time scale. This time around, we're going to be focusing on the Mesozoic, the so-called age of reptiles, at least as it is sort of popularly characterized. So, this is when non-avian dinosaurs were sort of the dominant animals on land, at least in terms of vertebrates, going from the Triassic to the Jurassic, and finally the Cretaceous, when they go extinct for the most part. And one of the things about the age of reptiles, though, is it's not sort of uniform, all reptiles are really doing great and having a great fossil record. Just as an example, let's go to this postage stamp, which represents the famous mural from the Yale Peabody Museum, Rudolph Salinger's The Age of Reptiles, so right there in the name. Not necessarily, an accurate depiction of these animals as we know them nowadays, but very much an iconic view of what sort of the age of reptiles was like. However, when you look at what makes up each of the animals in this mural, they're basically all archosaurs. So it's really only one subset of the group reptiles in the so-called age of reptiles. So what about all these lepidosaurs, everything on the lizard side of things? Well, there are a few Mesozoic groups that are really well-known lepidosaur fossils. So, some really unusual groups as well. Like this is a picture of a pleurosaur, which is an aquatic, actually even sometimes marine member of the Tuatara group. Some of the Tuatara relatives, like Priosphenodon here from South America, grew very large. So this was sort of like a dog-sized, probably plant-eating relative of Tuataras. So, again, showing some of that diversity in Rancocephalians I was mentioning earlier. And there are some, very notable squamate groups in the Mesozoic, the most famous of which being the mosasaurs. These were true lizards. These are giant marine squamates, restricted to the late Cretaceous, where they sort of became the dominant marine reptiles, and include some of the largest marine reptiles of all time. So things like Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus, would have exceeded 40 feet in length, have gotten as much as 60 feet in length. So really, gigantic and powerful predator. But one thing you'll note is that all of these groups that I've been mentioning, they're in the late Jurassic and then into the Cretaceous. So what's going on right at the beginning of the Mesozoic and the Triassic? The Triassic is a period, we've talked a lot about on this show, in part because it's the time period that I specialize in for my research. But it's really fascinating because it's at the end of the biggest mass extinction of all time, the end Permian event. And it sort of sets the stage for all of the animals that we really know about that are still alive today. So all of the major animal groups of the modern world really get their start in the Triassic. And this is true for, basically all the modern reptile groups. But for the most part, the fossil record, as it has shown us, the Triassic, vertebrate record, is dominated by archosaurs. So archosaurs, and then the turnover, sort of the replacement and possible competition between them and synapsids, which eventually give rise to mammals. So, a lot of depictions of what's going on in the Triassic are all these archosaur groups, things on the crocodile or dinosaur line, and then these waning groups of synapsids. So, your typical, image or illustration of what's going on in the Triassic, you see a lot of crocodile-like animals, you see a lot of dinosaur-like animals, and their, various prehistoric relatives. But you're not seeing much in the way of anything that is a real lizard line thing. So much as we say, dinosaurs are terrible lizards, they're not lizards, they're not closely related to lizards at all. Much more closely related to crocodiles and ancestral to birds. So where are the true lizards in the age of reptiles? Well, they've been very difficult to find in the Triassic. So there are records of some of these Rancocephalians, these Tuatara relatives. This is an animal called Clevosaurus, which is quite common in the latest Triassic and the earliest Jurassic. But it's already a very advanced in its way Rancocephalian. So there's a lot of similarities in just sort of the general morphology, the shape of the skull between this animal and the living Tuatara. So this is very far along sort of the evolutionary line to Tuataras. It's nothing like the common ancestor of Tuataras, lizards, and snakes. And that's, sort of what's been missing for a long time in, reptile paleontology. And really has been quite a mystery until just in the past few weeks. There's actually just been a flurry. We've gotten very lucky in the past months. They've had a ton of new papers out on the origins of lepidosaurs, of the sort of the lizard lineage, involving specimens, from crossing continents around the world. And just going to go into, three of what I think are the most important of these that have come out. Just sort of to situate yourself in the world. So we've got this world map here. We're going to be starting out in South America, in northwestern Argentina, in the Isigualasto Formation. So this is exposed in Isigualasto Provincial Park, mostly in San Juan province, but these exposures cross a few of the provinces in sort of the foothills as you're getting up to the Andes there. Really, gorgeous landscapes, otherworldly in many ways, and spectacular for paleontologists because they're just full of all sorts of wonderful late Triassic fossils. So the best known of which includes the world's oldest definite dinosaurs, things like Herrerasaurus here, and other well-known taxa like Eoraptors from these same beds, but also a lot of synapsid fossils and sort of crocodile line fossils. So really, great representation on the archosaur side of things. But as is typical of the Triassic historically, there was very little, basically nothing in terms of the lepidosaurs, in terms of the lizard line, which is why it was so exciting when, this paper really just came out a couple of weeks ago by Ricardo Martínez and colleagues describing a new, very early diverging, what we might call basal lepidosauromorph from this area. This is an animal called Titolura alcoberi, and it's known from this, really nice complete skull and lower jaws that you can see at top there as depicted in the paper. And then, in the bottom right, this is how they've reconstructed the skull. So really giant eyeball there, lots of, little teeth. So, very, it is lizard-like in some ways. It has the two openings at the back of the skull. That's typical of all diapsid reptiles, but in other ways, very, very primitive. And they found it in this really big phylogeny they put together of lepidosaurs, archosaurs, and a lot of reptile groups. They recovered it as the very earliest diverging member of the lizard lineage. So this is an animal outside of the split between squamates and Rancocephalians, right at the base of what is called Lepidosauromorpha. Lepidosauria, technically refers to basically all of the living lepidosaurs, and then those things on the stem that are more closely related to those than to crocodiles and birds. But outside of that so-called crown group of all the living animals, those are lepidosauromorphs. So very, very primitive morphology of this, probably giving us a fairly good idea of what these, really basal lepidosauromorphs looked like. But one thing that, we need to keep in mind with this is that it is in the latest, well, not the latest, but it's in the fairly late into the Triassic. Whereas if you look at the earliest known archosauromorphs, things on the crocodile line, they're going back to the early Triassic, possibly even the late Permian, although that's sort of debatable. So if that's the case, there's a huge ghost lineage. There's could be missing like as much as 40 million years of fossil record of these lepidosauromorphs. So where are they? And that's where sort of the second paper that we're going to be talking about comes in. So this is talking about a fossil from the Catburg Formation of South Africa. So this is one of the parts of the Karoo Basin. And just to show you, this is going back to Triassic times, what the map would have looked like then. So, this is during Pangea, so they're not quite so far away. South Africa and South America were, basically connected at the time. But these are, separated by quite an extent chronologically. So early Triassic to late Triassic is tens of millions of years. And so the Karoo Basin, another really spectacular landscape, place where I love to do field work and do research there, and hope to get back there before too long. And it's characterized by these a really vast amount of outcrop. So 2/3 of the land area of South Africa has fossiliferous outcrop there. Now, the Catburg is one of the later parts of the Beaufort group getting into the Triassic, and is best known for this animal Lystrosaurus, which is a disaster taxon. It's one of these dicynodont synapsids. I'd say it's become a pretty beloved creature for many, but certainly for synapsid workers, it is iconic. So Lystrosaurus, sort of a stout pig-like animal that, when you go to Catburg exposures, it makes up 75% or more of the fossils that you find there. So just incredibly abundant animal in the fossil record. Much rarer is anything else, and super rare are things like this. So this is the only known specimen ever found of an animal called Palaguana, which was actually described a long, long time ago. The specimen or the taxon itself is not new. It was discovered in the early 1900s, actually. So more than 120 years ago now, Palaguana was discovered. But it's always been a very mysterious creature. So it was, as originally named, it was thought to have something to do with lizard origins. Hence, the name means ancient iguana, basically. But the specimen is very poorly preserved. They had very limited prep ability at the time, so it's a little roughly prepared. It's hard to see, really what's going on between the bones there. So it's remained kind of this mysterious animal for the past century. Until, of course, they were able to throw it into the synchrotron and get good CT scans out of it, as a lot of old and mysterious animals have really, been elucidated using CAT scanning technology now, using tomography with X-rays. And a group led by David Ford and colleagues, they just published this paper redescribing Palaguana on the basis of these CT reconstructions. And what they found was that it is indeed, it has something to do with lizard origins, but it's, it's not a squamate, it's not a Rancocephalian. It's another thing that falls down into this group of sort of stem lepidosauromorphs, things right there at the base, outside of the common ancestry of tuataras and lizards. So roughly in the same part of the tree as Titolura would be, maybe a little more towards the crown. But what's very important about this taxon is that it fills a lot of that ghost lineage, that gap in the record, because this is an earliest Triassic animal. So it's pulling it pretty close to the divergence with archosaurs. And what this indicates to me, at least, is that, lepidosauromorphs were probably, actually major components of Triassic faunas. It's not that they didn't exist, they weren't there, and may not, They may even have been, diverse and abundant, but we're just, having a very difficult time preserving them in the record and then, being able to find them as paleontologists. And it's probably because they're so small. So we know the fossil record is very biased towards large animals, particularly for vertebrates. There have been lots of studies looking at, carcasses nowadays, what's called actualistic taphonomy, the study of how things become fossils. That has shown that, if you put a cow out in a field and a mouse out in a field and let them rot, the big bones of the cow are going to, survive and have a greater chance of going into the fossil record than tiny sort of mouse bones, which are going to just be eaten by a scavenger or just like ground up or worn away by wind or water. So these really tiny little lizardy things, they're really, the odds are against them for both getting into the fossil record and then for paleontologists who, again, just have to look at the ground and see what's poking out to be able to recognize, some of these, in some cases, microscopic bones that are coming out of the surface. So it isn't, in some ways, it isn't surprising that, the Lipidosaur record has been so bad for so long. And as further evidence of that, and sort of the last taxon we're going to highlight, so Palaguana, in the early Triassic, but then you'll see there's another skull on this diagram shown next to it, which is this animal Marmareta. And so Marmareta is a much, much younger creature. And to talk about that, let's go actually all the way up to Scotland, so going up to the Northern Hemisphere, to the Catburg Formation on the Isle of Skye in the sort of the Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland. And this is an animal, Marmareta, species name is Oxoniensis. This was originally part of this Oxford marble discovered in England. But now there's a new specimen in this, what looks like just a block of rock shown at top there. But it's from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And once it was put through a CT scanner, revealed actually a really wonderful amount of the anatomy of both the skull and sort of the anterior skeleton there. That was used to put together, once it was segmented out, that skull that you see at bottom. So this is a paper that just came out from Elizabeth Griffiths and colleagues looking at the anatomy of Marmareta based on all of this new data. And what they found is, yes, it is also a stem lepidosaur morph. It isn't an early lizard. It isn't a Rancocephalian. It's part of this radiation that probably was present right from the start of the Triassic, maybe even back into the late Permian, although we don't have any evidence for that yet, and that it survived all the way through the middle Jurassic. So this is, very long span of time, maybe, as much as 100 million years of these stem lepidosaur morphs just out there crawling around, being tiny, probably eating bugs, and generally not making it into the fossil record. So there's clearly a huge amount about, the origins of these groups, and as well as the earliest members of the crown groups, the earliest Rancocephalians and squamates that we're just not finding. And so some of it, is probably lost forever. It just wasn't preserved. But there are ways that paleontologists can, pay more attention to these groups, focus on small-bodied faunas. Also, now that we have CT scans, we can throw a lot more into the scanner and not necessarily worry about damaging, tiny bones when we find them. So I think this is the start of what's going to be a lot more information on these basal lepidosauromorphs moving forward.
Yeah, that's so exciting that we've actually got 3 new animals after having, looking at that family tree for lizards and lepidosauromorphs, and it's like empty. And now we've got 3 in the span of like weeks. That's crazy to me.
Wild coincidence.
Yeah. And I was wondering, so you mentioned that, one of the things paleontologists can do to like reduce the bias of, just paying attention to these larger species is just by, thinking about these smaller species. But are there any actual techniques that paleontologists use when they go out in the field to help them find, smaller things that might be harder to find?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are, if you're specifically going for microvertebrates, a lot of what will happen is not even collecting individual fossils, but will be bulk collection of sediment and then doing what's called screen washing where you just basically take a lot of dirt or sand or whatever you have out there. If you've seen that there's a few like little, maybe a bit of tooth or a bit of bone in there, and then you'll put it over a series of basically sieves that will sort out basically, tiny bits of sediment from larger chunks, which may be fossil. And then you run water over it to sieve out all the sediment. And then of course, like you still get like pebbles and other bits of rock and things that you don't want. So then you have to pick it. So even after it's washed, it is, depending on how much sediment you're dealing with, you can weeks or even months of looking at it under a microscope with tweezers, getting the good stuff from the bad, or just like the non-useful. And, some things are very rare. Like there's a fossil mammal jaw from Madagascar that was discovered at the Field Museum by pickers while I was there, an animal called Umbundro mahabo. And it was a pair of volunteers that had been working on those samples for, I think, years at that point before they found the first mammal, like just finding no mammal teeth whatsoever. So it takes a lot of patience to go through that stuff. So again, a reason, not everyone has access to, just being able to pick for that long.
Right.
But if you want to find tiny stuff, that's sort of like the approach you need to take. And that's something that we're implementing at the museum here. So we've now built what's called the SED shed out at the Prairie Ridge Eco Station, which is going to be dedicated to screen washing and picking Mesozoic fossils.
Oh, that's really cool. I hadn't heard about that, actually. What is it called again?
The SED shed.
SED shed?
Yeah. The shed where we have our sediment samples.
Yeah, SED. Okay, sediment. Oh my God. I love it. That's great. Yeah, that's really cool. So another thing, you mentioned that they have all of these 3 different skulls from these lepidosaurimorphs. So they had these large eye sockets, so large eyes. But I feel like lizards today, for the most part, don't have large eyes. I mean, maybe, geckos, I feel like compared to their skull size, maybe their eyes are a little bit bigger. But I'm thinking of maybe monitor lizards and their eyes seem smaller. So is that like a major difference between?
I mean, the modern diversity of lizards is so great that they have everything from animals with much larger eyes compared to these things, which some geckos do, to things that are much smaller. So there are a few things that tend to correlate with large eyes. If they're nocturnal, certainly, like in geckos' cases, and they're still very sight focused, but they're living in very low light conditions. A big eye can help to get in sort of like every little bit of light to see a potential bug that you want to eat, or to escape a potential owl that might be hunting you or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas like really fully daytime lizards, tend to have smaller eyes, but it's also based on size. Like, Komodo dragon has proportionally smaller eyes than smaller monitor lizards. Things like, animals that we were talking about actually do have very, very large eye sockets in their skull, but the eyes themselves that are not as big as a gecko. A lot of it is like what's called allometry, which is just the scaling of organisms and the sort of the proportions of the different parts relative to size. So like a smaller animal generally will tend to have relatively larger eyes than a larger animal within sort of the same group. But like I said, there's a lot of diversity. These things vary depending on evolutionary history, sort of individual development, and various life history habits, aspects of their ecology and feeding.
And Anne is reminding me that I asked everybody earlier about their favorite lizard. Anne's favorite is a house gecko. And Christian, you mentioned earlier that your favorite lizard is an earless monitor.
Yeah, well, I don't know. It's hard to choose, but I think it's one of the coolest lizards out there for sure.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of one, and I love lizards, so I mean, it's awesome. And if you want to tell us about that, you can. But that spurred Anne's question: do any lizards have ears?
Yeah, so a lot of none of them have ears like we do. So like mammals have a very specialized structure called the external pinna, which is this cartilaginous base that has sort of exposed flesh on it, that helps to basically collect and direct sound waves into our very specialized ear canal. But lizards, they have independently derived a fairly complex hearing system. So if you look at a lot of lizards, they do have a hole at the back of the skull, which is their ear. And they have a structure called the columella in there, which is sort of it's a bone that vibrates and, allows them to hear sound waves the same way that our middle ear bones do. And so you get development of ears in a lot of the different vertebrate groups, like in frogs and toads have what's called the tympanum, which is like that eardrum-like structure you can see at the back of the skull. And they also have specialized bones and sort of tissues for hearing there. But yeah, most lizards do have an ear hole. It's been lost in a few groups, like the earless monitor for one. Snakes are also sort of notorious for having lost a lot of aspects of the skull because snakes are so highly specialized. Like they don't have eyelids. They don't really have ears in the same way that lizards do. It doesn't mean these things are, completely unable to hear, but they don't have like the ability to differentiate complex sounds like we and a lot of lizards do. So it's more, all hearing is just basically the brain interpreting vibrations in the atmosphere. So, even, if you're an animal that doesn't have an eardrum or any specialized organs, like even just having the skull near the ground, you can feel vibrations of something stepping towards you is sort of a form of hearing. So they've got ways, but there are lots of lizards that have like proper ears.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really cool. So animals like Titolura and the other two that were found, we don't have animals like that around today, right? I mean, we've got the tuatara, and then we have like the worm lizards, and then we have like these kind of true lizards. I don't know if they're actually ever called that, but why do you think that we don't have these lepidosauromorphs around anymore?
Well, I mean, I think we're super lucky just to have tuataras.
Yeah.
There are a lot of the varying fortunes of why certain groups flourish and some groups don't. It's very contingent on what was happening at a particular point in history, their existing specializations, whether they're evolving right before mass extinction and so are likely to be wiped out by that. With lepidosauromorphs, clearly they had a good run. Like if they made it from the early Triassic through at least the middle Jurassic, and we don't know they didn't last longer than that. There's an animal called from the early Cretaceous of Mexico, actually, Huehuequespali mixtecus, which was originally described as a lizard, and now has more recently been recovered as sort of an early diverging squamate, but something outside the crown. But even then, it's a little questionable its exact phylogenetic position. So it's possible that some of these stem representatives could even have made it into the early Cretaceous. It's why these groups were finally lost. Like we really can't say because the fossil record is so bad. Like there's another group on the amphibian side of things called albinerpetids, which are neither salamanders, frogs, nor caecilians. They're none of the modern amphibian groups, but they're sort of related to them. And so they must have diverged probably back in the Permian even, or at least early Triassic. And they lasted almost, well into the age of mammals. Like they lasted into the tertiary, and then just like didn't quite eke by to make it to the modern age. So in geological timescale, was the blink of an eye we missed out on having albinerpetids alive today, and we really don't know why they went extinct at the end. So it's tough to tell. Like there's research looking at competitive exclusion or what are called key innovations, which is the argument that if a group evolves a certain character that makes it super successful, but it's very difficult to test this sort of stuff. So I mean, squamates are super successful nowadays, and you can say sort of post facto, the squamate, whatever they're doing is right, and whatever tuataras did was wrong, because tuataras are not super successful nowadays. But, Rancocephalians were super successful for most of the Mesozoic. And then really it wasn't until the Cretaceous extinction that wiped out most of their diversity. So I don't think we can hold that against them. Like I said, it's a lot of bad luck, a lot of contingencies.
Yeah, I like that. We can't hold that against them if they're, not doing too great. And is it true that tuataras have a third eye?
So most amniotes do ancestrally. So even our synapsid ancestors have the third eye. So it's not really an eye, though. It's not capable of distinguishing images. So it's what's called the pineal eye or the pineal organ. So it's a photosensitive structure that is like right on the middle of the forehead that's connected to the brain by the pineal canal. So tuataras have it, but most lizards have it too. Maybe like 50% or more of lizard diversity has this structure. So some reptiles have lost it. Crocodiles and turtles don't have an external pineal eye anymore. Also, I didn't mention turtles earlier because whether they're archosaurs or lepidosaurs is still controversial. Molecular evidence is now pretty strong for them being on the archosaur side of things, but it's a fraught point among paleontologists. But if you look at the earliest representatives of all of these groups, they all have that third eye, the pineal eye. So it's just an ancestral feature of amniotes.
Gotcha. And you know what? I'm actually remembering that we talked about this last season of Old News. Pineal eye. There was I can't remember which episode exactly, but yeah. Well, that's great. So we have a question from the chat from Annie. And Annie wants to know, what about horseshoe crabs? What dinosaur is it? Because just to preface this, we were talking earlier in the chat about how turkeys and birds evolve, are dinosaurs and are reptiles and evolved from dinosaurs. So Annie, horseshoe crabs are not dinosaurs, but I'll let Christian give the full. And actually, I'm wondering, are horseshoe crabs sometimes called living fossils?
Yes. So, I mean, they're called living fossils. Maybe the referring to like them being from the age of dinosaurs. And so, yeah, the living horseshoe crab, Limulus, is often called a living fossil just because this group that it belongs to, the Xiphosurans, is the name of the group, which means sword tails. So they have remained pretty conservative. Like if you go all the way back to the Devonian, if you go back, let's say, more than 300 million years and see a horseshoe crab, then it looks pretty much like a horseshoe crab today. That's not to say they're exactly the same. That's not to say that their ecology and their genetics haven't changed in that time. But just in terms of the general morphology, what would be called sort of the bow plan of them, they look very similar. They're very conservative. And also, it's another one of those groups that, it's at relatively low modern diversity. So there's only a few genera of surviving horseshoe crabs, and they're somewhat limited in sort of where they're found in the world. With that said, they're not like Limulus polyphemus, the horseshoe crab that we get here on the East Coast, is not an unsuccessful animal. You used to find them by the thousands at beaches. And generally don't get those giant swarms anymore, mostly from pollution and sort of human overhunting. But until recently, they had tons and tons of them. So it is, does it have to be like doing poorly in some way to be considered a living fossil? That's part of, I think, why scientists are trying to move away from calling things living fossils. I generally only use the term to refer to animals that were first, or plants, there are fewer of those, but there are some, things that were first discovered as fossils, at least by sort of Western paleontologists, and only later were sort of found alive by scientists. So like the coelacanth is sort of the classic example of that. And that's also, that really sort of ticks all the boxes of what one would want of a living fossil, because it was both, first discovered as a fossil, then discovered alive. It's sort of, been morphologically conservative for the past 100 million years. It's sort of the sole survivor, this relict of an ancient age. But yeah, it gets to be very complicated, trying to pin down exactly what a living fossil is.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you for answering that. I have one last question for you. Going back to, the research that we talked about earlier, what are you personally most excited about, that you can study now that these species have been named and discovered and all of that? Like, are you excited to learn more about modern day lizards? Like, what are the potential new research avenues, I guess, that can come from this?
Well, there's a lot you can do now that you have good Triassic sort of lepidosaur a lot of it has to do with sort of broad scale analytical studies. So for example, a lot of looking at evolutionary radiations requires like very precise calibration of where certain lineages originated. So if you have like 100 million year span where it could be any time there, you're going to get really bad results in terms of like, when did lepidosaurs start diversifying? Like, when did they start getting big? What is their ancestral body size? What is their ancestral food? So all these things, like, without that data, it's very hard to start to say anything about that. Whereas now, we have that data to an extent at least, and can, start to also figure out how these were as living things. Like, what role did they play in Triassic ecosystems? Why did they evolve as they did? Like, why are they so small and thus have a bad fossil record, whereas archosaurs are generally so big and have a good fossil record? These are the sorts of questions that if you don't have any fossils of them, you just can't answer. So, I mean, these are definitely research topics that I know various labs are already looking into, and certainly we'll be able to do with a lot more specificity moving forwards now that we have all these great new discoveries, and certainly more to come.
Yay! Oh, so exciting. And actually, Christian, I noticed that none of these creatures had paleo art. You usually show us some paleo art with the new discoveries, and is that because it's like too early? No one has illustrated them?
There's a picture out there for Titolura that I've seen. Other ones, I don't think they've at least weren't any associated with the paper or in the press releases. But yeah, if you Google Titolura, there's some good art of that out there.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna need to see pictures of this like tiny lizard-like creature. I love those. So if you're listening out there and you're a paleo artist and you want to do Palaguana or Marmareta, then send it to us. I don't think anyone would do that. But well, thank you so much, Christian, for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
Thank you everybody for watching and sharing your questions with us. Congratulations to Anne, our bingo winner. We hope that you join us for next month's episode of Old News. So mark your calendars for October 12th, 1 p.m. We will hopefully see you there. And if you want to receive reminder emails and supplemental resources for the program, you can register. You can sign up for free. There's a link in the video description below. And before you go, I did want to highlight that right now the museum is celebrating Bug Fest. So it's our annual celebration of insects. And what is our theme this year is the bee. So we've got lots of bee programming going on this week. You can watch lots of different live programs. You can watch recordings of the programs as well here on our YouTube channel. I think the next one is at 3 p.m. So bugs on film. Yeah.
Oh, it sounds exciting.
It is exciting. It is Adrian Smith from the Ant Lab YouTube channel.
He has incredible footage of all sorts of bugs, but certainly hymenopterans, paramount among those. So yeah, don't miss that.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to be there because I'm hosting. So. Okay. Oh, all right. Well, thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.
Yeah, bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Christian.
Bye, Albie. Good to see you.
Yeah.